Welcome to Revelation Unraveled. I am your host, William Tapley, also known as the third eagle of the apocalypse and the co-prophet of these end times. And I'm wearing a nice warm shirt today because this morning in Forestport, New York, it was 27 degrees below zero. And it is still below zero out there, so it is very cold. And I'm sure it's cold where you are because I believe this cold wave stretched even into the deep south of the United States. And this program will be part 4 in my series on the book of Tobias. And we are going to make an amazing discovery. And that is, I believe this book tells us the length of time of the marriage supper of the Lamb. Now, as you know, many Bible scholars believe that the 7 years of tribulation has not yet begun. And that's because they believe that the marriage supper of the Lamb lasts for 7 years. Now, they base this on the fact that the ancient Hebrew marriage feast lasted for 7 days. And since the rapture has not yet occurred, therefore, the 7 years of marriage has not yet occurred in heaven, the marriage supper of the Lamb, and the 7 years of tribulation, therefore, cannot yet have occurred. And of course, as you, my regular subscribers, know, I've been saying all along that not only has the 7 years of tribulation begun, but the second half of the tribulation has begun. In other words, the 3.5 years of great tribulation. Of course, all we have to do is look around us to see that the great tribulation cannot be of great consequence. And of course, the answer is, Jesus is shortening the days. But how much longer will he shorten the days? As I have said many times on this program, I believe Armageddon occurs in the fall of 2017. And I believe the book of Tobias tells us how long the marriage supper of the Lamb will last. Therefore, all we have to do is to subtract that time from the fall of 2017. And I believe we are going to find out that the rapture of the church must occur this year, in the year of 2015. And of course, if the rapture occurs this year, then the terrible effects of the Great Tribulation, including the reign of the Antichrist, will also occur this year. But now first I want to review some of the amazing prophetic discoveries we have already made in the book of Tobias. And I must admit, 6.5 years ago, when I began this series on YouTube, I did not understand that Tobias was prophetic. In other words, this has been a learning experience for me also. In fact, I want to relate an interesting anecdote. I first came to understand the literary aspects of the book of Tobias way back in 1958 at a class I attended at Columbia University with the very famous professor Mark Van Doren. In fact, I attended the very last class he taught at Columbia, and the reason I remember is because it was very difficult for me to find my regular seat because the room was filled with reporters and television cameras and everything else. And as usual, I'm sure he gave a very amiable and intelligent lecture, as he always did. He was a much-loved professor, a very nice gentleman, and of course he passed away many years ago, but I enjoyed all his classes. I believe he gave me a B+ on my Tobias paper, but of course he was also known as an easy marker. In any case, neither Professor Van Doren nor myself nor anyone else understood at that time that the book of Tobias is an amazing prophetic book of these end times. So now, let's review some of the amazing discoveries we have already made in this prophetic book of Tobias. First of all, the elder Tobias symbolizes God the Father. His wife Anna symbolizes the Israelites, and together they symbolize the Old Testament. the younger Tobias, the son of Tobias the father, symbolizes the Son of God. In other words, Jesus Christ. And his bride, Sarah, represents the church. And together, they represent the New Testament. Now, when Tobias the elder sends Tobias the younger on a distant journey, that symbolizes the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and his being sent to heaven. And both Anna and Tobias the elder grieve over his leaving. Now, when Tobias the younger is in this distant land, he marries Sarah, and that symbolizes the marriage supper of the Lamb. That is, when Jesus marries his raptured church. And how long does this marriage of Tobias with Sarah last in this book of Tobias? And the story tells us that it lasts twice as long as the traditional Hebrew wedding ceremony. As we read in chapter 8, verse 23 of Tobias. And Raguel, now that's the father of Sarah, adjured Tobias to abide with him 2 weeks. And what I am saying is that those 2 weeks symbolize 2 years. And if I am right, that means that it represents only slightly over half of the 3.5 years of Great Tribulation. In other words, the rapture is mid-trib. So what makes me think that the book of Tobias is prophetic? Well, we've already seen how the prophecy lines up with the rest of end times prophecy in Scripture. But at the end of the book, we find that Tobias, the elder, gives true prophecy. He tells the younger Tobias and his bride Sarah that they must leave Nineveh upon his death, because Nineveh will be destroyed. Now it's interesting that his prophecy came true. Remember, Jonah had prophesied that Nineveh would be destroyed in 40 days, and that did not come true because God relented, because Nineveh repented. However, this time, Tobias' prophecy is true, and he shows himself to be a true prophet. In fact, I believe Tobias, who was probably the author of the book of Tobias, is one of the great hidden prophets of the Old Testament, along with the author of Esther, who was probably Mordecai. And it's interesting to note that there is also a hidden prophet in the New Testament. And who would that be? Well, there is one person who had to have dictated a lot of the Gospels other than the apostles, because they were not there. And that would be, of course, Jesus' mother, Mary. So, in conclusion, if I am right that the marriage supper of the Lamb lasts 2 years, as symbolized by the 2 weeks of the wedding of the younger Tobias and Sarah, and Armageddon occurs in the fall of 2017, obviously the rapture would have to occur this fall, the fall of 2015. On the other hand, Jesus could very well shorten the days at the end of the Great Tribulation, just as he is shortening the days at the beginning of the Great Tribulation. In other words, I would seriously advise you to trim your wicks and keep oil in your lamps starting today, if you haven't done so already. And finally, of course, I would like to remind you about my ThirdEagleMedia.com website. Please go there, click on either Daniel or Zechariah or my copy of the book of Revelation Unraveled, where I've unsealed all the great prophecies of those prophets.